In this video, we'll look into indexes and some practical examples. Index makes retrieval of data from table or views faster. The following are main index types: clustered index and non-clustered index. Clustered index sort the rows based on key values. Non-clustered index contains key values and pointers to data row. Example, a phone book is a non-clustered index, contains key values and pointers to the data row. Clustered index, create it if the query returns most of all columns from a table. Non-clustered index, create it if the values are to be updated constantly. Clustered index, create it if the query outputs data in the same order as your input. Non-clustered index, create if records are to be quickly inserted and updated. So let us see some examples now. So let us create an index text table. Create table SQLBasics.dbo.indexText. SQL Basics is the database name. ID int null. First name varchar of 50 null. Last name varchar of 50 null. So let us create this table. Execute. Right click tables, fresh. Index test has been created. The columns are ID, first name, last name. Now let us create a clustered index. Create clustered index C1 on SQLBasics.dbo.textTest on the column ID. On the ID column, we are creating that clustered index. So now, if I right click indexes, fresh, C1 clustered index has been created. If I double click this, you see ID. On ID, it is created a sorting order is ascending, integer, 4, identity no, allow nulls, yes. So it is a clustered index, and index table name is index test, index name is C1. And to drop that index, we say drop index C1 on SQLBasics.dbo.indexTest. If I right click, push, index has been dropped. You can as well create the index from here. Right click, new index, clustered index. I can name it as C1 and index key column, add the ID. Say OK. So C1 clustered index has been created. So we can as well create it from here, or we can write a query to create the clustered index. Same is the case with non-clustered index. So to let us drop this again, we can drop it from here to, you can select it and delete it. Press the delete button. Or we can use the drop index C1 on SQLBasics.dbo.index. Now let us create a non-clustered index. This should be non-clustered index. For non-clustered index, there is no need for us to mention it as non-clustered. For clustered, we have mentioned it as create clustered index. But if we just say create index, it will create non-clustered index. Create index and C1 on SQLBasics.dbo.indexTest on the column ID. Execute. Right click indexes, fresh, and C1. Drag this. non-clustered index NC1 has been created. If I double click this, so it is table name is index test, index name is NC1, the non-clustered index, ID is the column on which we have created the index. There are no included column. We'll come to it. Okay. Now to drop the non-clustered index, we say here select this drop index NC1 on SQLBasics.dbo.index. Execute. Right click indexes, refresh. So index has disappeared. Now we can create a composite index, that is creating on two columns, first name and last name. Create index CFL on SQLBasics.dbo.indexes first name comma last name. Completed. Right click indexes, refresh. CFL is non-clustered index on first name and last name. So we created a non-clustered index. Let me delete this and say clustered index. Okay, now execute this. Right click indexes, refresh. Clustered index has been created. If I double click this, it is on first name and last name, and it is index type is clustered, index name is CFL. So drop index CFL on SQLBasics.dbo.indexes. Execute. Right click index, refresh. It has been dropped. Now let us create non-clustered index on first name and last name. If I execute this, right click indexes, refresh. Non-clustered index. It's a non-clustered index on first name and last name. So drop that non-clustered index, first name, last name, right click, refresh. Now this is a covering index. We create covering indexes when some of the some of the columns are selected in the select list. So for example, if I say select first name comma last name from, give a gap here, from SQLBasics.dbo.indexes text test. Paste it. Where ID is equal to, so there is a query like this, and if we have created an index on ID, because ID is in the where clause, then we can include first name last name columns in the non-clustered index, so that there is no need to create index for this first name and last name. Only the columns that are in this where class, for those columns we create the index, and for the columns that are in the select list we include them, and that is called covering index. So let us right click this, refresh, nothing here. So create index COVINDX on SQLBasics.dvo.index test of ID, include these columns first name and last name. Execute. If I right click, refresh, COVINDX, the non-clustered index, so double click that. So COVINDX name, ID is the on which we created the index. We have included the columns first name and last name. So that will cover the whole list of columns that are being accessed in this query. And if you want to drop that index, drop index, COV index, SQLBasics.dvo.index. Right click indexes, refresh. So that's how we can create indexes, index the clustered index, non-clustered index, and the covering index or composite index. If you like the video, please subscribe by clicking on the subscribe button. For notifications on upcoming videos, please click on the bell icon.